Tonight, we drift back over 2,000 years to the dusty sandals and dramatic sighs of a 20-year-old who didn't just dream of conquering the world. He actually did it. But don't worry, we'll tell it so slowly, so soothingly, that even war elephants would doze off. This is the story of Alexander the Great, told with just enough boredom to tuck you in tight. So grab your blanket, silence your ambitions, and let history lull you to sleep. And hey, before you nod off like a Macedonian soldier, after a long march, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Whether you're in London, Lisbon, or lying upside down in your blanket burrito, we want to know. Your location may not help Alexander conquer the world, but it might help this channel conquer the algorithm. In the year 356 BCE, in the Kingdom of Macedon, a place that sounds like a medieval dental condition, a baby was born who would one day conquer half the known world. His name? Alexander. His cry? Probably regal. His diaper? Definitely not historically documented. His father, King Philip II, was a man of ambition, military genius, and a beard that could intimidate entire city-states. His mother, Olympias, was a priestess of a snake-loving cult, and possibly the original inventor of dramatic parenting. Legend has it, she slept with serpents and whispered bedtime stories about Zeus. Alexander grew up believing he was descended from gods, which, to be fair, is a pretty strong start for a toddler resume. From a young age, Alexander showed signs of greatness, or at least signs of being very difficult to babysit. He tamed a wild horse named Bucephalus at age 12, which impressed his father so much, he allegedly said, "Macedon is too small for you." A touching moment if you ignore the fact that Philip had just bought the horse and was probably annoyed it came without instructions. Then came the tutors, and not just any tutors. Alexander was assigned Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle, the philosopher, the guy who invented logic and probably made dinner conversation unbearable. Aristotle taught Alexander everything: ethics, politics, biology, and how to sound smart while saying things nobody understands. Under his guidance, Alexander read Homer's Iliad so many times he started quoting it in casual conversation, which made him either a genius or the ancient version of that kid who only speaks in movie quotes. Despite all this brilliance, Alexander's childhood was not without drama. His parents fought like rival empires. Philip remarried. Olympias threw shade. There were palace intrigues, assassination plots, and enough gossip to fuel a Macedonian tabloid. Through it all, Alexander remained focused, brooding, and probably very good at staring dramatically into the distance. By the time he turned 18, Alexander was already leading cavalry charges and winning battles. At 19, he was basically a war intern, and at 20, after Philip was assassinated at a wedding by a disgruntled bodyguard with a flair for timing, Alexander became king. No pressure. It was supposed to be a celebration, a royal wedding, a moment of joy, but in true ancient fashion, someone brought a dagger instead of a gift. King Philip II, Alexander's father, was assassinated by a disgruntled bodyguard named Pausanias, who, according to historians, had a personal vendetta, a flair for drama, and absolutely no chill. The assassination happened in public, which was rude, and at a wedding, which was tacky. Philip collapsed, the crowd gasped, and Alexander, just 20 years old, suddenly found himself king. No coronation, no warm-up, just instant leadership. like being handed the keys to a chariot you've never driven while it's already on fire. Now, becoming king of Macedon wasn't just about wearing a crown and looking majestic in profile. It meant dealing with rebellions, lots of them. The moment Philip's body hit the floor, neighboring regions started whispering, maybe we don't have to listen to Macedon anymore. Spoiler, they did. Alexander's first royal act wasn't a parade or a speech. It was a swift, calculated crackdown. Thrace rebelled. Alexander marched. Illyria rebelled. Alexander marched harder. Thessaly hesitated. Alexander gave them a look. They stopped hesitating. But the real test came from Thebes. Ah, Thebes, a city with a proud history, a strong army, and a deeply unfortunate sense of timing. They thought Alexander was just a kid with a fancy horse. They were wrong. Alexander surrounded the city, offered them a chance to surrender, and when they refused, he destroyed it. Not metaphorically, literally. Walls, homes, statues, gone. Thebes was erased so thoroughly that even their pigeons had to relocate. This sent a message to the rest of Greece. Yes, I'm young. Yes, I have great hair. But I will absolutely flatten your city if you test me. After Thebes, the rebellions stopped. Alexander was officially in charge. The Greek city-states reluctantly agreed to follow him into his next adventure, invading Persia, because nothing says team building like a multi-year military campaign across deserts, mountains, and places with names that sound like ancient salad ingredients. And so, with rebellions crushed and his authority established, Alexander turned his gaze eastward. He packed his armor, kissed his scrolls goodbye, and prepared to march toward the Persian Empire, but not before making sure his horse was comfortable. Bucephalus was a diva, with rebellions squashed and his crown firmly glued to his youthful head. Alexander turned his gaze northward, not because he was particularly interested in Thrace, but because Thrace was being annoying. The tribes there had decided that a 20-year-old king probably couldn't handle a good old-fashioned uprising. Spoiler, he could, but not without a lot of walking. Alexander's army marched into Thrace with the enthusiasm of a group project in a philosophy class. The terrain was mountainous, the weather was moody, and the locals were not exactly rolling out the welcome amphorae. But Alexander, ever the overachiever, decided to build a road through the mountains. Not a metaphorical road, a literal one, through rocks, with tools. Slowly, this road-building project was less about infrastructure and more about showing off. Look, Alexander seemed to say, I can conquer you and improve your commute. The Thracians were unimpressed. They attacked anyway. Alexander responded with a series of battles that historians describe as strategic and insomniacs describe as perfect background noise. One particularly thrilling moment involved Alexander's troops forming a phalanx, a tight formation of spears and shields that looked like a very aggressive game of human Tetris. The Thracians charged. The phalanx held. The spears poked. The shields blocked. It was all very dramatic in slow motion. Eventually, the Thracians gave up, not because they were defeated, but because they were bored. Alexander had proven his point. He was king. He was capable. And he had a road. The region was pacified, which is a fancy way of saying everyone stopped yelling. But Alexander wasn't done. Oh no. He turned west toward Illyria, where more tribes were testing his patience. These tribes had names like Taulanti, and Dardanians, which sound like rejected Star Wars characters. They too thought Alexander was just a kid with a shiny sword. They too were wrong. After a few more battles, a few more speeches, and probably a few more dramatic hair flips, Alexander had secured the northern borders of his kingdom. He returned to Macedon victorious, dusty, and slightly annoyed that no one had invented deodorant yet, and just when he thought he could take a nap, he received word. Thebes was rebelling. Again. Alexander sighed, mounted Bucephalus, and rode off to remind Greece who was boss. Thebes would soon learn that bedtime stories about Alexander were best told with a whisper and a warning. Just when Alexander thought he could take a breather, maybe sip some lukewarm goat milk and admire his new throne, Thebes decided to rebel. Again. Yes, that Thebes, the city that had already tested Macedonian patience and apparently thought round two would go better. The Thebans had heard rumors. Rumors that Alexander was dead, or sick, or on vacation, or possibly turned into a constellation. These rumors were, unfortunately for Thebes, very wrong. Alexander was alive, healthy, and extremely not in the mood. When word reached him, he didn't send a letter. He didn't negotiate. He didn't even post a passive-aggressive scroll on ancient social media. He marched. Fast. Like, blink, and there's a siege tower outside your window fast. Thebes was caught off guard. One moment, they were celebrating their imaginary victory. The next, they were surrounded by 30,000 Macedonian troops and a very annoyed 20-year-old with a point to prove. Alexander offered them a chance to surrender. The Thebans declined. Perhaps they thought he was bluffing. Perhaps they were sleep-deprived. Perhaps they had never seen what happens when a young man with divine delusions and a well-fed army gets cranky. What followed was not a battle. It was a demolition. Alexander's forces stormed the city with the precision of a bored chess master. Walls crumbled. Streets flooded with soldiers. Statues wept, probably metaphorically. In a matter of hours, Thebes was reduced to rubble and regret. The aftermath was brutal. Over 6,000 Thebans were killed. The survivors were sold into slavery. The city itself was razed, flattened so thoroughly that future archaeologists would need a magnifying glass and a prayer to find it. Alexander didn't just destroy Thebes. He made it a cautionary tale, a bedtime story for rebellious city-states. Don't be like Thebes, parents would whisper to their children. Clean your sandals and respect the king. The message was clear. Alexander may be young, but he was not to be trifled with. Greece got the memo, loud and clear, in rubble font. With Thebes erased and his authority unquestioned, Alexander turned his gaze eastward. Persia awaited, and so did the kind of battles that historians love and insomniacs adore. With Greece pacified and Thebes reduced to a cautionary tale, Alexander was finally ready to begin his world tour. His destination? Persia. His mood? Determined. His army? Slightly sweaty. But first, he had to cross the Hellespont, a narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, and the ancient equivalent of a passport checkpoint. Alexander didn't just cross it, he made a thing out of it. Before stepping foot on Asian soil, he performed a dramatic ritual. He threw a spear into the ground and declared the land his by right of conquest, which is a bold move, considering he hadn't actually conquered anything yet. It's like showing up to a buffet, stabbing a breadstick and yelling, "Mine!" His army, around 40,000 strong, followed him across the water in ships that creaked ominously and smelled faintly of ambition and fish. The crossing was slow, ceremonial, and probably involved a lot of seasick soldiers pretending to be brave. Once on the other side, Alexander visited the tomb of Achilles. Yes, that Achilles, the hero of Homer's Iliad, the guy with the famous heel and the even more famous mood swings. Alexander admired Achilles so much, he reportedly ran around the tomb in a full armor, which was either a tribute or a very intense cardio session. From there, the march began. The Persian Empire stretched endlessly before him. Cities, deserts, mountains, and bureaucrats. Alexander's army moved like a well-oiled phalanx, which is to say, slowly, methodically, and with lots of shouting in ancient Greek. The first real challenge came at the river Granicus, where Persian satraps, regional governors with fancy hats, had assembled an army to stop him. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, Alexander stood on Asian soil, wind tousling his historically significant hair, eyes scanning the horizon like a man who just discovered the conquer setting in a strategy game. He was ready. The world was not. Alexander had finally arrived at the river Granicus, which sounds like a fancy bottled water brand, but was, in fact, the site of his first major showdown with the Persian Empire. The Persians had gathered their forces on the opposite bank, looking fierce, shiny, and slightly overdressed for a river fight. The Persian satraps, regional governors with titles longer than their battle plans, had assembled cavalry, infantry, and enough decorative armor to blind a historian. They were confident. After all, Alexander was just a 20-year-old with a horse and a dream. How dangerous could he be? Very. Alexander, never one to shy away from drama, decided to cross the river immediately. His generals advised caution. "Let's wait," they said. "Let's plan." Alexander responded with something like, "Nah," and charged into the water like a man who just discovered the heroic entrance button. The river was fast. The banks were steep. The Persians were ready. It was, by all accounts, a terrible idea, but Alexander had a secret weapon, reckless confidence, and a really good helmet. As his troops splashed across the river, Persian cavalry met them midstream. Spears clashed, horses neighed, soldiers slipped on wet rocks. It was chaos, but the kind of chaos that historians later describe as tactically brilliant, because Alexander didn't know to drown. At one point, Alexander himself was nearly killed. A Persian noble raised his sword to strike, but one of Alexander's bodyguards intervened, leaping in with the kind of dramatic timing usually reserved for slow-motion movie scenes. Alexander survived, which was great for history and slightly disappointing for the Persians. Eventually, the Macedonians gained the upper hand. The Persians retreated. The river flowed on, unimpressed. Alexander had won his first major battle in Asia, and he celebrated the only way he knew how, by sending spoils back to Greece and commissioning statues of himself looking heroic. The victory at Granicus sent a message across the Persian Empire. Alexander was not just a kid with a shiny sword. He was a kid with a shiny sword and a winning streak. And so, with the river behind him and the empire ahead, Alexander marched deeper into Persia, his sandals soggy, his ego inflated, and his army slightly damp, but very proud. After his soggy victory at Granicus, Alexander continued his march through Asia Minor with the confidence of a man who to just won a river fight, and the ego of someone who read the Iliad too many times. His next opponent, Darius III, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and the guy who really didn't want to meet Alexander in person. Darius had assembled a massive army, tens of thousands of soldiers, chariots, cavalry, and enough gold to make a dragon blush. He was ready, or at least he thought he was, because when Alexander finally met him at the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, things went downhill faster than a Persian chariot on a muddy slope. The battlefield was not ideal. Narrow coastal terrain, squishy marshes, and the kind of cramped space that made maneuvering large armies feel like trying to parallel park a war elephant. Darius had the numbers, Alexander had the strategy, and a horse named Bucephalus, who was probably tired of all this nonsense. Alexander's forces formed a phalanx so tight it could have doubled as a group hug. His cavalry flanked, his infantry pushed, his eyebrows furrowed dramatically. Darius, meanwhile, watched from a golden chariot, probably wondering why his army was suddenly losing. At one point, Alexander spotted Darius in the distance. The Persian king, realizing things were going poorly, did what any self-respecting monarch would do. He fled, fast. The royal chariot peeled out like a getaway cart in an ancient heist movie. Darius left behind his troops, his treasure, and, awkwardly, his family. Alexander, ever the gentleman, treated Darius's mother, wife, and daughters with respect. He even reassured them that Darius was still alive, which was generous, considering the king had just ghosted his own battlefield. The victory at Issus was huge. Alexander gained prestige, loot, and a reputation for being the kind of guy who could make emperors run for the hills. He sent news of his triumph back to Greece, where people celebrated by carving statues and probably mispronouncing Issus. But Alexander wasn't done. Persia was vast. Darius was still out there, and Alexander had a new goal: chase the King of Kings across deserts, mountains, and increasingly dramatic battlefields. And so, with Issus behind him and destiny ahead, Alexander marched on, his armor gleaming, his horse sighing, and his enemies reconsidering their life choices. After chasing Darius III halfway across Asia and winning the Battle of Issus, Alexander decided to take a detour. Not to rest, mind you. Resting was for mortals. He headed south to Egypt, a land of pyramids, priests, and enough sand to exfoliate an army. Egypt, at the time, was under Persian control, but the locals weren't exactly throwing parties about it. So when Alexander arrived, they welcomed him like a long-lost cousin who brought snacks and military superiority. No resistance, no rebellion, just open arms and probably a few awkward ceremonial dances. Alexander, never one to miss a branding opportunity, decided to build a city. And what did he name it? Alexandria, of course. Because if you're going to conquer the world, you might as well leave behind a chain of cities named after yourself. It's like ancient franchising. Alexandria was designed to be a hub of culture, trade, and statues of Alexander, looking thoughtful. It had wide streets, a harbor, and eventually a library, so big it could hold all the scrolls you'd never read. The city would go on to become one of the most important in the ancient world. But at the time, it was mostly sand and ambition. Then came the spiritual upgrade. Alexander journeyed deep into the desert to visit the Oracle of Siwa, a mystical place where priests whispered secrets and the sun made everyone question their life choices. After a long, hot trek that probably involved a lot of complaining from the horses, Alexander arrived, the oracle declared him the son of Amun, the Egyptian god of gods. This was a big deal. It meant Alexander wasn't just a king, he was divine. Sort of. Semi-divine. Like a celebrity with mythological endorsements. Alexander took this very seriously. He began referring to himself as a god's son, which made dinner conversations awkward and royal decrees slightly more dramatic. His soldiers nodded politely. His enemies rolled their eyes. His mother probably said, "Told you so." With Egypt under his control, a new city bearing his name and divine status freshly stamped on his resume, Alexander turned his gaze back east. Darius was still out there, probably hiding behind a curtain of bureaucracy and increasingly nervous generals. And so, with sand in his sandals and destiny in his pocket, Alexander marched on, his ego glowing, his army growing, and his legend slowly becoming bedtime material. After being declared a god in Egypt, which, let's be honest, is a pretty solid resume bullet, Alexander decided to take things one step further. He wanted confirmation, not from his generals, not from his mom, from the universe itself. So he set off across the desert to visit the Oracle of Siwa, a mystical shrine tucked deep in the sands of western Egypt. It was remote, sacred, and, most importantly, rumored to offer divine validation. Basically, it was the ancient version of Googling, "Am I destined for greatness?" but with more camels. The journey was long. The sun was relentless. The sand got everywhere. Alexander's army trudged through dunes like a caravan of cranky toddlers on a forced nature walk. At one point, they reportedly got lost. Ancient sources claim they were guided back on track by ravens, or snakes, or possibly a very confident cactus. Historians disagree. Horses probably rolled their eyes. Eventually, they reached Siwa. The temple was quiet, mysterious, and smelled faintly of incense and existential pressure. Alexander entered alone, because nothing says, "I'm important," like solo access to a divine hotline. What happened inside? No one knows exactly. The priests whispered. Alexander asked questions. The oracle responded, possibly in riddles, possibly in dramatic pauses. But when Alexander emerged, he was glowing, not literally, just emotionally. He claimed the oracle had confirmed he was the son of Zeus Ammon, a fusion of Greek and Egyptian deities. This meant he wasn't just a king, he was divinely endorsed, like a cosmic influencer with celestial sponsorship. His soldiers nodded politely. His enemies groaned. His mother probably sent a fruit basket. From that moment on, Alexander leaned into the whole divine son identity. He started writing letters with phrases like, "by the grace of the gods," and occasionally referred to himself in ways that made dinner parties awkward. But hey, if you're going to conquer the world, you might as well do it with heavenly backup. With the oracle's blessing tucked into his metaphorical back pocket, Alexander returned to Egypt, packed up his army, and prepared to chase Darius III again. The Persian king was still out there, still running, and still very much not ready for a god-tier opponent. And so, with sand in his boots and destiny whispering sweet nothings, Alexander marched east, his ego now officially endorsed by the cosmos. By now, Alexander had conquered cities, crushed rebellions, been declared a god, and built a town named after himself. Naturally, the next step was to fight the biggest battle of his career, Gaugamela, a name that sounds like a desert, but was actually a dusty plain in modern-day Iraq. Darius III, still recovering from his dramatic exit at Issus, had regrouped. This time, he wasn't messing around. He brought a massive army, some say over 100,000 troops, including cavalry, infantry, archers, and war chariots, with scythes attached to the wheels. Yes, scythes, because nothing says I'm overcompensating like weaponized wagon wheels. Alexander, meanwhile, had about 47,000 troops and a horse with a superiority complex, but he had something Darius did not see, a brain wired for battlefield geometry and a flair for dramatic timing. The night before the battle, Alexander slept soundly. His generals panicked. His soldiers sharpened spears. Bucephalus probably snored. Alexander's calmness was either divine confidence or the ancient version of fake it till you make it. At dawn, the armies faced off. Darius had chosen the battlefield carefully. Flat terrain, perfect for his chariots. Alexander responded by adjusting his formation, like a man playing chess with spears. He extended his right flank, baiting Darius into attacking. Darius took the bait. The chariots charged, and promptly got stuck. Turns out, scythed wheels don't work well on uneven ground and panicked horses. Alexander's troops opened gaps in their lines, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through like confused parade floats. Then they closed ranks and attacked. Alexander led a cavalry charge straight at Darius. Dust flew. Spears clashed. History held its breath. And then, just like last time, Darius panicked and fled. Again, the King of Kings had become the king of sprinting. Alexander considered chasing him, but decided to secure the battlefield first. Priorities. The Persian army collapsed. Macedon had won. Again, the victory at Gaugamela was decisive. Alexander now controlled Babylon, Susa, and the Persian heartland. Darius was officially dethroned, unofficially embarrassed, and spiritually exhausted. Alexander, meanwhile, was just getting started. He entered Babylon like a rock star, accepted gifts, and probably gave a speech that included the phrase, "I told you so." But even with Persia under his belt, Alexander wasn't satisfied. There were more lands to conquer, more statues to commission, more bedtime chapters to write. And so, with Gaugamela behind him and glory ahead, Alexander marched on, his legend growing, his enemies shrinking, and his bedtime story getting increasingly long-winded. After the dust settled at Gaugamela, and Darius III fled like a royal track star, Alexander entered Babylon, the jewel of the Persian Empire, the Vegas of antiquity, minus the neon lights and questionable buffet choices. Babylon welcomed him with open gates and even wider flattery. The locals had seen enough of Darius' disappearing act and figured Alexander was the upgrade they didn't know they needed. Priests offered gifts. Nobles bowed. Someone probably threw rose petals, or whatever the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent was. Maybe date pits. Alexander, ever the conqueror with a flair for interior design, was impressed. Babylon had hanging gardens, allegedly, massive ziggurats, and more gold than a reality TV reunion special. But beneath the glitter was something far more dangerous: bureaucracy. Yes, the true enemy of every conqueror: paperwork. Alexander had to manage taxes, appoint governors, reorganize satrapies, and listen to people explain grain logistics in excruciating detail. He held court, he signed things, he nodded thoughtfully, while secretly wondering if he could conquer boredom next. He also began adopting Persian customs, not because he liked their fashion, though the robes were comfy, but because he wanted to unify his empire. He wore Persian clothes. He sat on a Persian throne. He even tried the royal gesture of proskynesis, a deep bow or kiss the floor move that made his Macedonian generals clutch their pearls. They weren't thrilled. "We conquer Persians," they whispered. "We don't become them." Alexander responded with a speech about unity, destiny, and probably something involving Zeus. The generals grumbled. The scribes kept scribbling. Meanwhile, Darius was still on the run, hiding somewhere east, with fewer troops and even fewer options. Alexander sent letters urging him to surrender. Darius responded with silence and strategic vanishing. So, Alexander did what he always did. He marched, but not before leaving Babylon in the hands of trusted officials, a few statues of himself, and a very confused tax department, and thus, with bureaucracy temporarily tamed and his empire expanding like a well-fed scroll, Alexander continued his journey toward more battles, more cities, and more opportunities to look majestic in profile. After conquering Persia and collecting more titles than a medieval fantasy novel, Alexander marched into Central Asia. His goal, to subdue the region of Sogdiana, a land filled with rebellious nobles, dramatic landscapes, and fortresses built by people who clearly didn't want visitors. One fortress in particular stood out, the Sogdian Rock. Perched high on a cliff, it was the ancient equivalent of saying, "You can't sit with us." The defenders laughed from above, confident that no army could reach them. They even sent Alexander a message. "You'll need wings to take this fortress." Alexander blinked, then smirked, then probably whispered, "Challenge accepted." He gathered a group of his best climbers, soldiers who were either brave, reckless, or deeply confused about the assignment. Using tent pegs, ropes, and sheer stubbornness, they scaled the cliff at night. No ladders, no siege towers, just gravity-defying ambition, and a lot of grunting. By dawn, the climbers had reached the top. They waved flags to signal their success. The defenders, seeing Macedonian troops where no troops should be, panicked. They surrendered immediately, because when your enemy appears on a cliff you thought was impossible, it's best to just hand over the keys and rethink your life choices. Alexander didn't gloat much. He accepted the surrender, secured the fortress, and added Rock Conqueror to his growing list of achievements. The story of the Sogdian Rock became legendary, a tale of boldness, creativity, and the ancient version of extreme sports. But it wasn't just about climbing. It was about sending a message. No fortress is too high. No rebellion is too remote. No bedtime story is too long. With Sogdiana pacified and his climbers probably nursing sore calves, Alexander continued his march eastward. India awaited. So did elephants and philosophical crises. But for now, he had conquered a rock, and that was enough drama for one chapter. After scaling cliffs, crushing rebellions, and collecting divine titles like they were ancient Pokemon cards, Alexander decided it was time to settle down. Not permanently, of course, just long enough to marry someone strategically important and moderately attractive. Enter Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan. Known for her beauty, intelligence, and the unfortunate timing of being born in a region Alexander had just conquered, she was captured during a campaign, and instead of sending her off to a distant palace or awkwardly ignoring her existence, Alexander did something unexpected. He fell in love, or at least, he fell in political love. Their marriage was part romance, part diplomacy, and part ancient PR stunt. By marrying Roxana, Alexander hoped to win over the local population, unify cultures, and prove that he wasn't just a conqueror. He was a culturally sensitive conqueror with a flair for wedding speeches. The ceremony was modest by royal standards. No elephants in tuxedos, no fire-breathing chariots, just a quiet gathering, some traditional rituals, and probably a lot of confused Macedonian generals, wondering why their king was marrying a woman they couldn't pronounce. Roxana, for her part, handled it gracefully. She adapted to court life, learned the customs, and probably spent a lot of time nodding politely while Alexander explained his latest battle strategy using fruit as metaphors. The marriage marked a turning point. Alexander began encouraging his soldiers to marry local women, blending Greek and Eastern cultures like a historical smoothie. It was all part of his grand vision: one empire, many peoples, and absolutely no room for rebellion. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Some Macedonians grumbled, some Persians side-eyed, but Alexander didn't care. He was building a legacy, one wedding at a time. And so, with Roxana by his side and diplomacy tucked into his toga, Alexander continued his march eastward, toward India, elephants, and the kind of existential crises that only happen when you've conquered most of the known world and still feel oddly unsatisfied. By now, Alexander had conquered Greece, Persia, Egypt, and a few mountain fortresses that required climbing gear and questionable decision-making. So, naturally, he looked at the map, squinted eastward, and said, "Let's go to India." India, at the time, was a land of rich kingdoms, philosophical depth, and animals that made Bucephalus look like a pony. Alexander had heard tales of war elephants, massive tusked beasts, trained for battle. His response? "I must see these oversized cows immediately." The march into India was long, hot, and spiritually confusing. The terrain was unfamiliar. The monsoons were dramatic. The local rulers were skeptical, and Alexander's army was starting to ask questions like, are we still conquering, or are we just sightseeing aggressively? Eventually, Alexander met King Porus, a ruler of the Punjab region, who was tall, proud, and had a personal herd of war elephants. The two clashed at the Battle of Hydaspes, a muddy, rainy affair that felt more like a wrestling match in a puddle than a traditional battle. Porus's elephants charged. Alexander's troops panicked. Horses screamed. Soldiers slipped. It was chaos with tusks. But Alexander, ever the strategist, used his cavalry to flank the elephants, confuse them, and turn the tide. Porus fought bravely, refused to surrender, and only gave in when he was physically unable to continue. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus famously replied, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed by the sass and dignity, agreed. He made Porus an ally, gave him back his kingdom, and probably offered a complimentary elephant grooming voucher. But something shifted in Alexander. The battle had taken a toll. His army was tired. The elephants were intimidating. The terrain was unforgiving, and the philosophical depth of India, its sages, its spiritual teachings, made Alexander pause. He began to wonder, what's the point of all this conquering? Was he chasing glory, or just running from boredom? Was he building an empire, or just collecting cities like ancient Pokemon? His soldiers, meanwhile, were very clear. We're tired. We're done. We miss Greek food. Alexander tried to rally them for further conquest. They mutinied, politely, firmly, sleepily. And so, with elephants behind him and introspection ahead, Alexander turned back, his dreams of reaching the ends of the earth paused by the very real limits of human endurance and sandal durability. The year was 326 BCE, and Alexander had reached the banks of the Hydaspes River, a wide, rain-swollen stretch of water that looked less like a battlefield and more like a place you would de-cancel plans to avoid. On the other side stood King Porus, a towering ruler with a regal glare, and an army that included something Alexander had never faced before: war elephants. These weren't your average circus elephants. These were tusked tanks, trained to trample, stab, and generally ruin your day. Porus had dozens of them, lined up like nature's version of armored SUVs. Alexander's troops, who had bravely faced everything from Persian chariots to mountain fortresses, took one look and said, "Are those tusks with spears?" Alexander, of course, was thrilled. He loved a challenge. He also loved dramatic entrances. So he waited for a stormy night, crossed the river in secret, using boats and stealth, and surprised Porus with a dawn attack. Because nothing says good morning like cavalry charging through puddles. The battle was messy. Rain poured. Mud splashed. Horses slipped. Elephants screamed. Macedonian phalanxes tried to hold formation while dodging tusks the size of tree trunks. It was less like a battle and more like a very aggressive zoo tour. Porus fought valiantly. He rode atop an elephant like a royal action figure, commanding his troops with dignity and dramatic hand gestures. Even as his army faltered, he refused to surrender. Alexander admired this. He liked people who didn't quit, even when they were losing spectacularly. Eventually, Porus was captured. When brought before Alexander, the young conqueror asked how he wished to be treated. Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed by the sass and poise, granted him his kingdom back. He even gave him more territory, because when you fight like a legend, you get rewarded, even if you lose. The Battle of Hydaspes was a turning point. Alexander had proven he could defeat elephants, rivers, and stubborn monarchs. But his army was exhausted. The rain had soaked their spirits. The elephants had trampled their enthusiasm. And the idea of marching further into India made everyone collectively sigh. Alexander wanted to keep going. His soldiers wanted to go home. After some tense discussions, and probably a few passive-aggressive scrolls, Alexander agreed to turn back. After the soggy spectacle of the Battle of Hydaspes and his royal bromance with King Porus, Alexander stood at the banks of the Beas River, staring eastward into the misty unknown. Beyond lay more kingdoms, more elephants, and possibly more philosophical crises. Alexander naturally wanted to keep going. His army naturally did not. They were tired. Not just, "we need a nap," tired, existentially tired. They had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, scaled cliffs, crossed deserts, and endured monsoons that made their sandals squish. They missed home. They missed Greek wine. They missed not being chased by tusks. Alexander gathered his generals and gave one of his signature speeches. It was passionate. It was poetic. It probably included references to Achilles, destiny, and the stars aligning. He spoke of glory, legacy, and the thrill of conquering lands no Greek had ever seen. His soldiers responded with silence, then coughing, Then a polite but firm no. It was a mutiny, not with swords, but with stubbornness. The men refused to go further. They wanted to turn back. They wanted to see their families. They wanted to stop sleeping next to elephants. Alexander was stunned. He paced. He brooded. He probably stared dramatically into the river, hoping it would change its mind. But the bees didn't budge, and neither did his army. Eventually, Alexander relented. He agreed to turn back, but not without a final flourish. He built 12 altars along the riverbank, massive stone monuments to mark the easternmost point of his campaign. They were part tribute, part guilt trip, part ancient Yelp review. Alexander was here. He wanted to go further. His army said no. And so, the great march east ended, not with a battle, but with a collective sigh. Alexander turned his army around, beginning the long journey home. The men cheered. The elephants probably exhaled. Even Bucephalus seemed relieved. But Alexander wasn't done. Not yet. He still had lands to govern, cities to build, and a legacy to polish. The world tour was winding down, but the drama was far from over. After the mutiny at the Beast River, Alexander finally agreed to turn back. Not because he wanted to, but because his army had collectively reached the emotional equivalent of a flat tire. The dream of reaching the edge of the world had been postponed by blisters, boredom, and a deep craving for Greek olives. But the journey home wasn't exactly a victory parade. Alexander chose a route through the Gedrosian desert, a vast, unforgiving stretch of sand and regret. Why? Historians still debate. Maybe he wanted to prove a point. Maybe he misread the map. Maybe he just liked the aesthetic of suffering. The desert was brutal. Scorching heat, no water, sandstorms that rearranged your face. Soldiers collapsed. Supplies ran out. Even Bucephalus probably considered early retirement. Alexander, ever the dramatic leader, marched at the front, refusing special treatment. He shared rations. He encouraged his men. He probably gave motivational speeches that sounded inspiring until you realized you were chewing on cactus. By the time they emerged from the desert, the army was a shadow of its former self, sunburned, dehydrated, and spiritually overcooked. But they had survived. Barely. Alexander finally reached Babylon, the glittering city he had conquered years earlier. It welcomed him like a prodigal son with a god complex. There were celebrations, ceremonies, and probably a few awkward reunions with bureaucrats who had been filing scrolls in his absence. But something had changed. Alexander was no longer the wide-eyed 20-year-old with a spear and a dream. He was 32, tired, reflective, and possibly starting to realize that conquering the world doesn't come with a retirement plan. He began planning new campaigns. Arabia, maybe even Rome. He held meetings. He reorganized his empire. He threw parties that involved more philosophy than dancing. But beneath the surface, his health was fading. The desert had taken its toll. The years of marching, fighting, and dramatic posing had worn him down. And so, in the heart of Babylon, surrounded by luxury, legacy, and lingering exhaustion, Alexander prepared for the next chapter, one that would come sooner than anyone expected. Alexander had returned to Babylon, the city that shimmered with gold, incense, and the faint scent of administrative paperwork. He was 32 years old, had conquered most of the known world, and was still making plans. Because apparently, world domination doesn't come with a pause button. He talked of invading Arabia, mapping new trade routes, and possibly inventing the ancient version of LinkedIn to connect his satraps. But beneath the ambition, something was off. Alexander was tired. Not just, I need a nap, tired, cosmic tired. The kind of fatigue that even war elephants couldn't trample away. Then came the fever. It started small. A chill, a headache, a bit of dramatic pacing. But within days, Alexander was bedridden. His generals gathered. His physicians panicked. His scribes sharpened their quills, sensing history was about to get juicy. No one knows exactly what caused it. Malaria? Typhoid? Poison? A really bad Babylonian burrito? Theories abound, but the truth remains as foggy as a Macedonian morning after a victory feast. As the fever worsened, Alexander reportedly lost the ability to speak. His soldiers, desperate for reassurance, filed past his bed in silence, hoping for a nod, a wink, a thumbs up. He gave none, just a quiet stare, as if already halfway to Olympus. On his final day, someone asked, "To whom do you leave your empire?" Alexander, with what may have been his last breath, whispered, "To the strongest," which, historically speaking, is the ancient version of flipping the board and walking away. His generals stared at each other, blinked, and immediately began arguing. The empire would soon fracture into pieces like a poorly sliced baklava. And just like that, the conqueror was gone. No dramatic last words, no farewell tour, just a fever, a whisper, and a legacy so vast it would keep historians employed for centuries. Alexander was buried in a golden sarcophagus, possibly in Alexandria, possibly somewhere else, because even in death, he liked to keep things mysterious. His empire was divided. His cities remained. His legend grew. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of history, his horse, Bucephalus, probably sighed and retired to a pasture with a view. Alexander was gone. His body lay in a golden sarcophagus, location still debated. His sandals retired, and his horse, Bucephalus, presumably grazing in a field of well-earned peace. But his empire? Oh, that was just getting started on its descent into chaotic inheritance drama. You see, Alexander had conquered everything, from Greece to India, but he forgot one tiny detail, a succession plan. When asked on his deathbed who should inherit his empire, he allegedly whispered, "To the strongest," which is the ancient equivalent of tossing the crown into a gladiator pit and saying, "Good luck." The result? A geopolitical food fight. His top generals, known as the Diadochi, Greek for successors, but also guys who immediately started arguing, divided the empire like a badly sliced pizza. Each wanted a piece. Each thought they deserved the biggest slice. None of them had napkins. Here's how the toppings fell. Ptolemy took Egypt and said, "I'll take the pyramids and the library, thanks." He even stole Alexander's body and buried it in Alexandria, because nothing says, "I'm in charge," like owning the corpse. Seleucus grabbed Persia and much of the East, founding the Seleucid Empire and immediately inventing new coin designs with his face on them. Antigonus tried to take everything and almost succeeded, until the others ganged up on him like a historical group project gone wrong. Cassander took Macedon and Greece, and just to make things spicy, he allegedly ordered the execution of Alexander's widow Roxana and their son. So much for family values. The empire fractured into warring kingdoms, each ruled by a general with a crown, a grudge, and a very dramatic beard. Battles erupted. Alliances shifted. Maps were redrawn so often that cartographers started charging overtime. Meanwhile, the people who had actually lived under Alexander's rule were left wondering, wait, who's in charge now? The answer changed weekly. Despite the chaos, Alexander's legacy endured. His cities, especially Alexandria, flourished. His name echoed through history. His haircut remained iconic, and his story became the stuff of bedtime legends. But the empire he built? It didn't last. It splintered, squabbled, and slowly faded into the background noise of history, like the final notes of a lullaby played on a dusty lyre. Alexander the Great died over 2,000 years ago, but his story still lingers, whispered in classrooms, carved into marble, and now tucked gently into bedtime tales like this one. He was just 20 years old when he became king. By 32, he had conquered more of the known world than anyone before him. And yet, he never stopped moving, never stopped dreaming, never stopped marching toward a horizon that always seemed just one more battle away. He wasn't perfect. He was impulsive, dramatic, occasionally divine, and often very sweaty. He made bold choices, questionable detours, and speeches that probably sounded better in ancient Greek. But he was unforgettable. He built cities. He blended cultures. He inspired legends, and he left behind a legacy so vast that even his enemies couldn't help but admire it. His empire didn't last, but his story did. And maybe that's the point, because in the end, Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. He was a symbol of ambition, curiosity, and the restless human spirit. The part of us that wonders what's beyond the next river, the next mountain, the next chapter. So tonight, as you lie in bed, listening to the soft echoes of ancient sandals and distant trumpets, remember, greatness doesn't always come from reaching the end. Sometimes it comes from the journey itself. And if Alexander could hear you now, he'd probably say something dramatic like, "Sleep well, brave dreamer. The world awaits, but I'll keep it simple. Good night."